I was pregnant with Sarah when I first prayed that she'd take away my pain. I was sick of all the beatings, the cursing, the tormenting. My husband was not a nice man. Knowing that I'd soon be a mother was the wake-up call I needed. I left that night, packed my bags while he was out, bought a bus ticket, and disappeared. I prayed to God for Sarah, that she would take away my pain, that the beginning of her life would also mark a re-beginning of mine. What I didn't expect was for God to take my request quite so literally. It was only when she was just over a year old that I figured it out. Sarah was sitting in her high chair, watching Mommy cook. I was cutting up vegetables for our dinner when the knife slipped, slicing open the tip of my finger. I swore, rushing to grab a kitchen towel when suddenly the pain vanished. I stared at my finger as the wound sealed, leaving a perfect little white scar. Suddenly, Sarah screamed. I ran over to her and watched in horror as blood started to spill from a slice that slowly drew across her little finger. From that day onward, my safety was no longer my own, but Sarah's too. She took my pain, and we shared the same scars. One on the tip of our finger, one on our knee, one on the underside of our chin, one on the side of our left foot. All my scars were now hers, except for one. I was called to her kindergarten almost a year ago. Sarah had injured herself on the playground and they'd taken her to the emergency room. I wasn't to worry, they told me. It was a simple gash, but it probably needed a few stitches. That scar was her favorite, in the shape of a little star on her forearm. It was the only scar we didn't share. Our lives weren't perfect, but we were happy until he tracked us down. I knew it was him from the way he knocked on our door. That pounding held a familiar anger. I pushed Sarah into her room, told her to lock her door. I ran for the kitchen and pulled a knife from the drawer just as he kicked down the door, shouting and raving. He leapt for me, put his hands around my throat. It wasn't just fear for my life that made me lash out with the knife. It was for Sarah. His choking hands would end not just my life, but hers too. I buried the knife up to the hilt in his chest. There was hardly any blood, and without a sound, he dropped to the floor. I knelt down, shakily, feeling for a pulse at his arm. There was none. It was then that I noticed a small scar on his forearm. It was in the shape of a star. When Mom finished setting up the dining room table, a silence fell over my family. Jenny stopped laughing and closed her coloring book. She was young, but understood the rules. She walked down to the basement, and my dad locked the door behind her. The food would be out soon, and we didn't want to tempt her. I walked over to the dining room and waited for the food to be out. I was never sure where they kept it. I just knew that they went out of the sliding door and came back in that way with food. The food smelled wonderful. It always did. As we sat down, I watched my mother serve out the food. She seemed so calm and normal. I could hardly believe all the research I did. If it didn't come from my best friend, I wouldn't believe it either. My parents were abusing my sister. I moved the food around on my plate, wondering how much I could push into my napkin without them noticing. I put a few peas in my mouth and chewed them slowly. Ashley, my youngest sister, was slowly eating her food. She wasn't very curious about Jenny anymore. She'd stopped asking a few months ago. When Jenny was born, I was 9 and always asked why no one gave her food. "She can't eat ever," my mom had answered. "Why?" I had asked. "Because your sister is special," my mom had said. Looking back, I gave up too easily. I never asked enough questions. Jenny was never hungry. Even when I asked her, she said she wasn't hungry. As a baby, I had never seen her eat either. She never cried either. A fourth of my plate was already on my napkin. It was probably as much as I could sneak off with. My parents usually took our plates and threw the rest of the food down the garbage disposal. They mixed soap in with it. They also checked our pockets. No one had ever tried to sneak her food. We'd believed everything our parents had ever said. I slipped the napkin into my pocket. They probably wouldn't pat us down today. They had yesterday. It was rare now for them to check us. My mother took my plate and pushed the food into the disposal. We usually all lined up like little sheep to turn our food in. My dad kissed me in the cheek as I walked away. An hour after dinner and cleanup, Jenny was allowed upstairs again. We didn't talk about dinner with her. We just acted like nothing had happened. My parents sat on opposite sides of the rooms watching every move we made. Today, my mom was a little more distracted. She texted someone every few minutes. Jenny was playing with her dolls. She was sweet and innocent. The second Cammie explained to me that my family wasn't normal and probably doing something terrible, I felt bile rise in my throat. At 10, we were all in bed. My parents were also in bed. My phone vibrated. It was Cammie. She was ready with the plan. Soon, her car alarm was going off outside our house. The footsteps warned me as my parents made their way downstairs. I followed behind, dipping into their room first. Cammie promised they'd have spare keys, and they did. I grabbed every key I saw. The room to the basement where Jenny slept was locked. I tried each key, hands trembling until one finally fit. There was only a few peas, but it was enough for now. They'd go to the police soon. We just needed evidence. I'd slipped in just before my parents came in. The alarm was done. As I walked down the dark stairs, my phone light led the way. Jenny was at the bottom of the stairs in her bed. I walked over to her and shook her gently. She was confused, but awake. "What's going on?" she said groggily. "Shh," I said, and brought some peas out of the napkin. I rolled some peas into her mouth. She chewed them slowly, not sure what it was. "I'm not supposed to eat," Jenny said. I felt tears forming in my eyes. "You have to." She chewed the peas and seemed no different. She just looked up at me. I kept feeding her until it was done. She went back to bed and I stayed with her. I took pictures and video. I got all the evidence I needed. I heard her cry a little behind me. She was puking. Her face looked scared as she kept puking. Black sludge came out of her mouth. She retched and a tiny light blinked in the corner. "Jenny, are you okay?" my mom said. "A baby monitor." My heart raced. "I'm okay," Jenny said, but the sludge kept coming out of her mouth. My mom rushed downstairs, and when she saw me, she looked shocked and angry. You fed her?" she screamed. I heard more steps coming down. It must have been my dad. I wish I could disappear as they rushed over and helped Jenny. She cried after an hour of puking. After 2 hours, her face was still red and filled with tears. By the time the morning came, I was too stunned to ask. Jenny was no longer crying. The sludge was done. When we walked upstairs in the morning, my mom turned to me and said 2 things I'll never forget. "Never do that again. Your sister is not like us, okay?" I nodded. "Get into bed," she instructed. Breakfast went like it always did. Jenny locked downstairs and everyone else eating upstairs. I helped Mom clean up the dishes and dispose of all the food. This has not happened to me, but it happened to my brother, who is 2 years younger than me. He was the only one out of the family who experienced some kind of paranormal feeling, and I'm here to tell the story of what he calls the experience. The story of what is named the Help Me possession. It happened around late September 2016 when we were about to rest off for the night, around 9 on a school night. Sure, we were fooling around after the allotted time because we were young, but that doesn't excuse the experience afterward. It clicked around 10, and I was starting to nod off. I then heard my brother let out a deep moan. Then he sat up and got off his bunk. He looked at me, but I instantly knew something was wrong. He wasn't fooling around or cracking jokes. He just stared. Blankly stared, with sunken, black eyes and a very dark shadow over that. Now, naturally, my brother was dark-skinned, but not all that dark. He was a fair light caramel and can be spotted in the dark fairly easily. So when I noticed the difference between his fair skin and the darkened shadow around his eyes, my instinct kicked in. I pretended to sleep, and he ignored me. He normally announces that he needs to go to the bathroom or get a drink of water, but he left without so much as a raspy moan. Just silence in the dead of night. He left, and I followed with socks on so he wouldn't hear me. All of a sudden, he opens our front door to leave our apartment. That's when my grandmother woke up and asked me, "Who opened the door? Who left? Why are you awake?" I couldn't answer any of those, as I was scared to say anything. 5 minutes later, my grandmother finds out my brother left and screams out the window to tell him to get back inside. He comes back inside with tears rolling down his cheeks, but my grandmother doesn't notice and scolds him. What's strange is he's crying, but with no emotion, yet the sunken eyes and shadow are gone. We lay back down in our bunks and we whisper to each other, myself passing questions and him answering. "What happened?" I started.
"I don't know. I wasn't moving, but I was. It wasn't me."
"Was it a ghost?"
"I think so, but I thought this only happens in movies."
"Tell me everything. Let it all out," I say, trying to calm him down and being the big sister role model I am. He then says,
"I woke up with a very cold chill going down my spine. Then I saw you, petrified to move. Then I walked out the door with nothing but my underwear. I was scared. Then I saw hands and arms coming out the walls. And I cried, begging it to get out. I tried to call you guys, screaming for help, but nothing came out. I got outside and a shadow was running towards me with something bloody in his hands. Then Grandma called to me. I was free. And when I came up, I was being yelled at by Grandma. But I still couldn't talk because I still felt it, watching.
We got silent after that, and he fell asleep after a few minutes. But I couldn't. I was wide awake, scared out of my mind, feeling a very cold chill down my spine afterward.